story of what happens to the world we leave behind. In this episode of Life After People, man tried to preserve his legacy by hiding his treasures. People buried important objects, locked them away, launched them into orbit. And in one mysterious site in America, some literally created a crypt of civilization. But can any of these crypts stand the test of time? This is just part of a journey that will take us to the future of once crowded cities, as well as this abandoned mental hospital that some say is haunted. Welcome to Earth. Population 0. One day after people, on the campus of Oglethorpe University in Atlanta, Georgia, there is a small X carved in stone. Buried a few feet underneath is a forgotten crypt filled with strange relics of mankind that wait to be rediscovered. Mannequins stare with painted eyes into the dark, as if they're waiting for people to open the nearby cans of newsreels, waiting for human hands to open the violin case in the corner, or touch the keys of the typewriter. These fashion mannequins stand at a bizarre intersection between the immortal and the forgotten, waiting to be released from one of the world's strangest rooms, a time capsule called the Crypt of Civilization.
The Crypt of Civilization, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, was the first successful attempt to bury a record of our culture for future inhabitants or visitors to the planet Earth.
Everyday objects from toys to dental floss rest in steel cylinders filled with inert gas. Microfilms of 800 books, including the Quran and the works of Shakespeare, remain next to lipstick tubes, cigarette lighters, radios, the screenplay of Gone with the Wind. All objects carefully chosen to represent life in the 1930s. The crypt was conceived in 1936 by the university's president, Thornwell Jacobs. Inspired by recent excavations of Egyptian burial chambers, he wanted to create a 20th century version of King Tut's tomb. The objects in the crypt wait behind a stainless steel plate 1/8 of an inch thick, with instructions not to open the crypt until the year 8113.
The Egyptian calendar, most historians would say, begins in 4241 BC. 6,177 years had elapsed. So Dr. Jacobs, in his words, projected forward 6,177 years from 1936. And this is how he comes up with 8113 AD. So whoever opened the crypt would see what it was like at the midpoint of human history.
But can this crypt endure 6,000 more years? Days after people, all of man's attempts to preserve his legacy are in a battle against time. At Washington D.C.'s Marine Corps War Memorial, 6 bronze heroes of the World War II Battle of Iwo Jima still raise the American flag. The memorial was based on a photographic image of heroism so moving, people wanted it immortalized, not in fading celluloid, but in bronze. But with no people to remember the battle or protect the monument, how long will the Marines continue to hoist the flag? 32 miles away in Annapolis lies the crypt of a Revolutionary War hero, naval legend John Paul Jones. But what few knew was that this ornate crypt was not Jones's first resting place. Largely forgotten after the Revolutionary War, he was buried by a few friends and left in an unmarked grave for 100 years. In 1905, Jones's lead coffin was found and opened for an autopsy. The doctors expected to see the mocking grin of a skeleton. Instead, what the doctors saw shocked them. Although partially decomposed, John Paul Jones was preserved enough to be recognizable from 18th century busts. How was this possible? The answer: hoping Jones would someday be rediscovered, his friends had his coffin filled with methyl alcohol.
This slowed down autolysis, which is the body breaking down itself. The cells starting to break down. When those cells break down, bacteria move in and disintegrate the cells even more. But alcohol creates a near aseptic condition. That is, it kills the bacteria.
John Paul Jones was reburied with fresh methyl alcohol in a tomb in Annapolis, Maryland, a quarter-mile from shore. But doesn't a naval hero deserve a burial at sea? Four days after People, at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton in Southern California, some Marines remain on duty. German shepherds, who were part of the U.S. Marines Canine Corps, are now without superior officers. But they remember their years of intense training.
Their memory is fantastic. There's dogs that are trained to attack and find explosives, and then there's dogs who are trained to track humans and find them. They need to be able to, have that drive just like a Marine will.
Now, the more aggressive alpha males, uncaged when their masters vanished, go AWOL. Following orders from a new commanding officer: hunger.
The German Shepherd would definitely go after little animals and whatever they could eat. They are survivalists.
We had one dog at the kennels once attack a snake.
But outside Pendleton, the shepherds will not be the only predators. What will happen when hungry coyotes meet the last Marines? Meanwhile, some attempts to preserve man's legacy race against time by standing still. This CD-sized object holds the key to preserving mankind's written languages. Created in 2008 by an organization called the Long Now Foundation, it is etched with micro-sized writings. When magnified 1,000 times, it reveals 13,000 pages of text, from vocabulary lists to Bible verses, in more than 1,500 human languages. It was named after the Rosetta Stone, an ancient artifact which enabled researchers to decode Egyptian hieroglyphics. Copies of the Rosetta disk were sent to safe havens around the world, including the Smithsonian Institution, where thousands of other treasures are stored. Now, the lights have gone out. can this modern Rosetta Stone actually survive? While the ancients preserved vital objects and great leaders behind walls of stone, modern office buildings of steel and glass are crypts of information. In the time of humans, 1/3 of most office buildings was devoted to storing papers, from personnel files to government secrets. This was true from the canyons of Wall Street to London's financial district, where the most notable building was the 591-foot tower nicknamed the Gherkin.
The Gherkin building, called that because of course it looks like a pickle on end, is a very unusual building.
Its 745 double layers of glass panels let in so much natural light, the costs of heating and lighting the building were drastically reduced.
It uses only about half as much energy as a conventional office building does today.
Shortly after it was completed in 2003, one panel came loose and shattered over 300 feet below.
And that could be a clue to its eventual demise. Although it's an extremely well-designed building, it still needs to be maintained.
In the time of humans, a maintenance crew of 90 kept the Gherkin in good shape. In a life after people, how long before another panel falls, and another? One week after people, there's trouble on the high seas. This cargo ship was carrying 30,000 tons of wheat. The crew is gone. But the ship is not quite abandoned. The rats have taken over. In the time of humans, ship's crews battled rats with traps and poisons. But those days are over. A large rat of 12 or 13 ounces can eat 15% of its body weight in a day. But the rats won't just eat, they'll also breed. Female rats can have 6 litters in a year, with perhaps a dozen rats in each litter. And at the age of only 3 months, the young rats are themselves ready to breed. As vermin take over the world's shipping lanes, on the land, architectural wonders fall prey to hidden flaws, while a strange time capsule tries to preserve the memory of man 870 miles above the Earth. Six months after people, in Washington, D.C., the bronze Iwo Jima Marines remain undamaged, but the polyester flag was subject to fading in the sun and had to be changed once a month by an honor guard. In 1961, John F. Kennedy directed that the 190-square-foot banner on the 60-foot flagpole should be flown day and night forever to help people remember the courage and sacrifice at Iwo Jima. Now, half a year of sun, wind, and rain have torn the flag to shreds, and one gusty afternoon, the presidential proclamation is overridden by a harsh wind. In just 12 months, a pair of rats can produce 2,000 offspring. The green-greedy rats on the cargo ship have experienced a population explosion. The dark hold of the ship has become a moving wave of hungry, bleeding rodents. The rats' need for half an ounce of water a day has been satisfied by rainwater. But there's a problem. With no humans to work the bilge pumps, the cargo ship is taking on water in the middle of the ocean. As seawater saturates the grain, thousands of rats flee to the upper decks. But this is one sinking ship they can't desert. Around the world, man's attempts to measure the passage of time are fading away. When the power went out, electric clocks went dark forever. The batteries in some wristwatches may last for 3 years or more, but they too will stop. But what about a clock that won't stop? At least, not for 10,000 years.
The idea for the 10,000-year clock was developed by Danny Hillis, who is one of the people behind the development of the modern computer.
To create a clock that will keep accurate time for 10,000 years, Hillis designed a 60-foot-tall machine made of corrosion-resistant titanium and stainless steel. The sun will keep the mechanical clock accurate. At noon, solar heat focused through a lens makes a strip of tungsten buckle, and this motion resets the clock to exactly noon. To guarantee precise measurement of time over 100 centuries, the clock uses a sophisticated system of levers and pins that perform binary calculations.
So the 10,000-year clock is essentially the world's slowest computer, but there's nothing electronic in it. It's all mechanical.
Years after people, the coyotes that prowl the wild landscape that was once Camp Pendleton have learned to fear the strength of the last Marines.
One of our aggressive dogs came up to a coyote. They would definitely, overtake it just because of the training that our dogs have, and the dog will most likely kill a coyote.
Unlike most dogs kept as pets in the time of humans, many military-trained German Shepherds have survived.
I believe they would retain their training for a very, very long time. If they come up to a wall, they're not going to stare at the wall and go, woo, woo. They're going to jump over that wall, and they're going to complete the task that they need to.
Meanwhile, in the open ocean, the hungry rats have turned on each other. Now, everyone is dead of starvation or cannibalism, and their bodies are food for the hungry seabirds. Years after people. All is quiet at the world's largest library. The Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. contains nearly 142 million items on roughly 650 miles of shelves, including Matthew Brady's Civil War photographs and the personal effects Abraham Lincoln was carrying on the day he was shot. All of this is of little consequence to the swamp creatures now returning to this former capital of man. Years after people. The once manicured grounds of Oglethorpe University are choking under kudzu and wild poinsettia. But the granite building holding the Crypt of Civilization still stands secure. The crypt itself, surrounded by Georgia bedrock, was reinforced to survive the centuries by scientists who strengthened the cement floor of a 200-square-foot indoor swimming pool and waterproofed the walls with layers of porcelain enamel. After the crypt was sealed in 1940, some 20,000 other time capsules were buried around the world. When the publicity died, most were quickly forgotten and lost. For a while, this even happened to the crypt itself.
I was an undergraduate in 1970, and this area where the crypt is was sealed off. And I saw this stainless steel door, and I saw cobwebs on it. And then I pulled off the cobwebs, and I saw this message about 8113 AD. I had no clue what this was. The crypt was only 30 years old, and it had been forgotten.
Now, forgotten again, nothing much has changed inside the crypt. When its creator, Dr. Thornwell Jacobs, was choosing items to place inside, he was sure to include a vial of beer, specially brewed and bottled by Anheuser-Busch. Jacobs thought that even 6,000 years from now, whoever opened the crypt would still enjoy a foamy brew.
Dr. Jacobs admitted he had no notion of the far future, but he did think that people would be drinking beer, just the way the Egyptians drank beer. And the Egyptians put earthenware jars in their pyramid chambers.
After People. Not all time capsules are intended to remain on Earth. In the early 21st century, Europe's Kyo satellite was designed to orbit the planet, carrying a DVD with thousands of email messages from people around the world to the remote future.
It's called Kyo because K-E and O are sounds that are in most of the languages that humanity uses.
While the Crypt of Civilization was inspired by the first calendar, Kyo looked to an even earlier landmark of civilization.
The Kyo concept was that the first art on the planet was about 50,000 years ago.
Therefore, the Kyo is scheduled to return to Earth to be opened 500 centuries after its launch, having completed almost 300 million orbits. At 870 miles high, it's out of the path of most other satellites and space debris. But while an astro accident is unlikely in the near term, what happens when it's time for Kyo to plummet back to Earth? There's no need to wait to find out the fate of this haunted place. At this hospital that once housed the criminally insane, a life after people has already begun. Years after people. There are some places on Earth where mankind made no attempt to preserve his memories. Places so horrible, it was better just to forget. One of these places still stands on a sprawling patch of land in southeastern Connecticut.
It's as if there was a fire drill and nobody came back. It's kind of spooky.
Once, this was the Norwich Mental Hospital. It opened in 1904, and among its patients were some of the worst criminally insane offenders in the state. Men like Ernest Skinner, a teenager who attacked his neighbor with an axe before setting him on fire, and Matthew Knapp, who stabbed his 85-year-old grandmother to death with scissors because he thought she was possessed by the devil. It's no wonder, then, that many report strange happenings at the abandoned hospital.
There's a lot of people that think these buildings are haunted.
The souls here would have reason to be restless. Even for patients who weren't criminals, life at Norwich was a terrible ordeal.
back in the turn of the century, they weren't sure how to deal with mental illness.
This facility utilized straitjackets and rubber rooms and all the things that people think are horrible. I would imagine the cost of treatment in the early years was very punitive.
In the 1930s, Judith Riley's mother was a nurse at Norwich. Every day as she passed this building, she heard the screams of the criminally insane.
It must have been very chaotic, very noisy, just nonstop.
It's a very gloomy outset. The windows, first of all, consist of a grate inside, and then outside the glass you have steel bars, and outside of the steel bars you have a thinner grate. So there's a lot of metal between the people inside and the beautiful view outside.
In the 1970s, most of Norwich's criminally insane were transferred to Connecticut's prison system. The building that once held them was abandoned to everything but nature.
The vines and the trees and the shrubs infiltrate anything that has water. So if they can get to a crack in a building, they're in.
That wall behind me is 3 bricks thick, yet a small imperfection, in this case a missing piece of downspout, has put extra water into the bricks. During the winters here, the water freezes, expands, pushes the bricks out. More and more water gets in, and the entire wall begins to collapse. The building itself was abandoned in roughly 1970, but probably the downspout went missing about 15 years ago. It only took 15 years to do all of this damage.
At its height, the Norwich Mental Hospital covered 1,000 acres with 5,000 staff and patients. The hospital had its own farm and livestock, its own power plant, its own movie theater, chapel and bowling alley. Norwich shut down for good in 1996, but parts of the hospital have been deserted since the 1970s. By the late 1970s, when Judith Riley followed in her mother's footsteps to become a nurse at Norwich, medical practices had changed. Once popular surgical procedures like lobotomies were halted. Other controversial treatments, like electroshock therapy, were administered with greater care.
It was done perhaps inhumanely. Now I think that people are anesthetized properly, and before it wasn't always true. So people suffered.
I've heard third-hand of people that have been tortured and experimented on.
No one knows all the secrets Norwich hides. Abandoned rooms, like accidental time capsules, are still being discovered. Here, a basement with suitcases and clothes from patients who came to Norwich many decades ago. Here, a room from the 1970s, stacked high with typewriters.
It was as if somebody snapped their fingers and everybody was gone.
Equally eerie are the deserted tunnels that once connected every section of the hospital. They carried hot water pipes and much more.
They would have to move patients around from building to building in the dead of winter, late at night.
The tunnels were not always brightly lit. You had to make your way through with some caution. The patients weren't too happy. It is kind of spooky.
The administration building, constructed in 1904, was finally abandoned in 1996. Dust blown in from the outside mixes with peeled plaster from water-soaked walls.
The decay is not a straight line linear progression. It's exponential. I was on this site 6 months ago, and it was deplorable and falling apart. And then I was just on it recently, a few weeks ago, and I couldn't believe the difference.
The state just closed the door and took off. It shows disrespect, I think, for the years that the people were here.
Once, this was a place where people like Judith Riley hoped they could help others find their way back to society, to modern civilization. Now, Norwich is under the care of nature and may never be discharged. As decades pile up into centuries and architectural treasure meets its fate, a storehouse of civilization is attacked from below, and a rising tide conquers the crypt of a hero. Years after people, the Marine German Shepherds are not even a memory. Although their training helped them survive while other pets died, they could not breed among themselves. To prevent fraternization in the ranks, the Marines spayed their female dogs, although some shepherds mated with feral dogs. After a handful of generations, the distinctive German Shepherd breed has disappeared. 100 years after people. Even towers that still stand tall, like London's Gherkin building, are being stripped away.
In a life after people, individual glazing panels will begin to fall out of the external skin as the effects of wind and sun and rain have an aggravating effect on the condition of the materials.
Moisture slowly rusts the thin steel file cabinets and spreads mold on the forgotten files within. In place of file cabinets, some humans used home safes of tempered steel to protect valuables, not just from water, but from fire. Paper burns at 451 degrees Fahrenheit. Many home fires can burn 3 or 4 times that hot. Safes could keep the interiors at 350 degrees for a while. But though man thought his precious papers would be protected from the flames, even the strongest home safes are no match for the fires that burn unchecked for days on end. It only takes 2 hours for the heat to begin penetrating the weakened steel and start incinerating the papers within. 150 years after people. Time has run out prematurely for the 10,000-year clock. How could this happen? Because the real 10,000-year clock was never completed.
Right now there's just one prototype of the 10,000-year clock.
The 9-foot-tall prototype was put on display at the Science Museum in London as the year 1999 changed to 2000. But humans had to wind the prototype every few months. It stopped dead in the first year after people, and now lies in pieces as the stone structure around it has collapsed. Had the real 10,000-year clock been completed before mankind vanished, it would have been installed in a unique home, a hollowed-out limestone mountain in Nevada, 10,000 feet up and miles from civilization, where the sun would reset the clock by shining through a 4-square-foot window made of sapphire. The purpose of the clock was not to tell people the time, but to get them to think about humanity's future. A future that never happened. Not far from London's Science Museum, the Gherkin building's joints, exposed to corrosive moisture, fail where they have the most weight to bear: the floors.
Eventually, one floor could pancake onto another below.
But remarkably, the diamond-shaped supports maintain the building's skeleton. The Gherkin is weakened, but unlike most other skyscrapers, it still stands for now. Years after people, rising sea levels have thrust Maryland's tidal basin relentlessly inland to the crypt of John Paul Jones. One of the world's greatest sailors has finally received a burial at sea. For London's Gherkin building, the loss of most of its windows and floors has reduced the weight load on its steel frame. Partial collapse has prevented complete destruction. But 300 years of English weather has seeped into cracks in the structure's sealant.
Attacked by corrosion, the structural elements will be progressively weakened until finally, in a very extreme storm, a gust of wind will deliver the final blow.
A brace buckles, triggering chain reactions of failure and fracture in the trusses until the entire 30,000-ton framework fully yields to the force of gravity. Where steel has failed, bronze survives. The Iwo Jima Marines still strain to raise a flag that has been gone for centuries. Although swamp weeds cluster, one of war's most dramatic monuments endures. As the centuries turn to millennia, nature presses its advantage even into the best protected places. Can the treasures of the Crypt of Civilization really be safe from destruction? "500 years after people, man tried to preserve his civilization in libraries. Here, the memory of the past was available to all, but libraries were always vulnerable. The original Library of Congress was burned by the British in the War of 1812. Some 3,000 books on law, economics, and history were lost. Now, the dome of the library's Jefferson Building, completed in 1897 and rising 160 feet over what is now swampland, is putting too much strain on the supporting walls.
Because of the way that all domes are constructed, there is a weak point at the base of the dome where the dome wants to expand. It wants to push down and expand out.
The pressure becomes too great for the dome to bear. Concrete can no longer resist the greedy pull of gravity and falls in a shattering surrender. Years after people, copies of the Rosetta disc, preserving 1,500 human languages and dialects, still exist. Each disc was made of nickel, a metal that forms much of the core of the Earth. Nickel resists corrosion, but the texts of the disc are still vulnerable to the corruption of time.
It does accumulate a kind of microscopic goo over time. It is just, whatever's ambient in the air that lands on the disk. So fairly quickly, that material could build up.
2,000 years after People, a great deal of material has built up around one of the Rosetta disks. The Smithsonian Institution itself. May 28th, 8113. Time for the Crypt of Civilization to be opened. But it's long been buried by the collapse of the building around it, which now lies beneath a blanket of grass and trees. Outside the crypt, mold and plants pushed in through broken windows. Pressure from above cracked the crypt walls. Water and dank air seized the opportunity and invaded. Metal began to corrode and rust. The beer, which long ago went flat, then turned and soured. And moisture seeped into the plaster skins of the mannequins, oxidizing and cracking the idealized images of a lost humanity. Years after People. As planned 500 centuries earlier, the Keel satellite's orbit decays. On the way down, it's hit by micrometeorites and tiny fragments from other ancient satellites. But the Keel is prepared for this.
The basic idea of the design is to have concentric spheres of different materials, titanium, aluminum, some Kevlar, like multiple thermos bottles within itself, and then the payload is inside that.
The Keel, laden with messages from the 21st century, re-enters the atmosphere intact, with sunlight gleaming off its wings.
The Keel satellite's wings, they will be shiny, and the hopes are that anybody left on the planet could look up and see these shiny glints coming by and hopefully watch where it's going to land. But if nobody's there to see that, then it's not going to be a very useful alert system, will it?
The Earth is 2/3 water, and that's probably where the Keel will end its mission, in the place where life began. Now, sealed for eternity in the blue crypt of the sea, the 50,000-year-old messages wait for the future.
Why do we want to take stuff from today, put it in a box, and have people dig it up in the future and try to figure out what it is? I personally think that it's sort of our need to connect ourselves to humanity's future forever. We really want to feel like we were important or part of humanity.
Every crypt of civilization assumes that someone will be there on the other side of the Valley of Time. While some vessels won't survive the journey, each message to the future is a gift of hope, even in a life after People. In the next episode of Life After People, the Last Supper has been served. Now, some of the highest restaurants in the world satisfy an appetite for destruction. And see what happened when one real-life American supermarket was abandoned with all the food still in.